This month, dozens of Russians arrived at the US-Mexico border seeking asylum. Nearly all of them fled political repression related to the war. They're either active in the anti-war opposition or have connections to Ukraine. US border authorities turned them away, but they refused to leave and formed an encampment just on the Mexico side of the border crossing. As the camp grew bigger, Mexican authorities ordered them to move to hotels or shelters.
Are you willing to leave? When they tell you that you need to leave this place, are you willing to do that?
Нет, мы не готовы. No.
Никто не готов выходить с улицы, потому что мы боимся. Если мы покинем эту территорию, во-первых, мы больше сюда не вернемся, ее как-нибудь заблокируют, там ленточки повесят. Уже боимся даже спать здесь, потому что мы переживаем, что придут ночью, просто пока вас нет, пресса отдыхает, все спят, нас просто соберут вот так вот и увезут. Куда? Не знаю. Ждем решения Соединенных Штатов, потому что да, у меня там родственники, у кого-то тоже. У всех есть спонсоры. Спонсоры есть у всех. Мы все просим рассмотреть наше дело, наш кейс просто максимально быстро.
Obviously, the people leaving Ukraine right now are refugees from the war. Do you feel like you all also are refugees from the war?
Конечно, мы убежали из-за войны, конечно.
Абсолютно.
Просто от диктатора, от которого мы реально не выбирали, причем 3 срока. И первый срок тоже его никто не выбирал.
Забирают детей, отправляют на войну, это все что угодно.
Украинцев убивают бомбами, пулями, а нас убивают другим инструментом.
Customs and Border Protection turned the Russians away under Title 42, the pandemic-era rule that allows the immediate expulsion of asylum seekers without hearing their claims. The US has cited Title 42 almost 2 million times to expel migrants mostly from Mexico, Central America, and Haiti. But in the last 2 weeks, CBP began making systematic exceptions to allow in Ukrainians fleeing the war. At first, that exception didn't extend to Russians, but while we were at the encampment, that began to change.
Apparently, the Mexican authorities persuaded the Russian asylum seekers in the camp to pack up and leave. If they all leave right now, tonight, then tomorrow at 5 in the morning, they'll put them on a bus that'll cross the border into the United States.
The Russians were told not to speak to the press, but they were skeptical of the backdoor deal and shared the location of the hotel they were taken to. We waited there to see if they would, in fact, be moved to the border.
So it looks like this might actually be real. We have a bunch of Mexican immigration vans outside loading up their luggage. All the Russians are downstairs. It definitely looks like they're picking them up and taking them somewhere. We're just going to try and follow them to see where that actually is.
They were taken to a border checkpoint that's currently closed to the public, where nobody would see them cross.
So this is the US side of the border crossing that they took the Russian asylum seekers to. They're allowing in this, in the scheme of things, very small and completely arbitrary group of asylum seekers based on a totally informal, irregular, kind of ad hoc decision in negotiations with authorities from the Mexico side.
That secret agreement left tens of thousands of asylum seekers on the Tijuana side who never got the same treatment the Russians did.
It's telling in and of itself that the Americans are so concerned about keeping this under wraps. I'm assuming that that's because they're afraid that it will draw more people from Russia and perhaps even other countries to try and achieve the same goal.
We spoke to a member of the encampment who separated from the group because he has valid papers to enter the US. His ex-wife Irina and their 3 children crossed the border as part of the secret agreement and were still detained the next day as CBP processed their claims.
Она сказала, что условия очень плохие, но как бы терпимо, да, ну.
Have they been told anything about how long they should expect to be detained?
Вот, к сожалению, нет. потому что бордеры и детеншены переполнены, и вот неизвестно, сколько их будут держать.
Once Irina and everyone else are released, do you know what their plan is? And also, what about your plan? When and where are you planning to join them?
Перейду границу в Сан-Диего и с Ириной улечу сразу в Хьюстон. С Ириной и детьми, когда ее выпустят. Я еще здесь, в Тихуане.
David Noriega is with me now for more. David, I understand there's a big update in the status of these Russian refugees. Tell me about it.
Yeah, so we know now that a few of the families that were allowed to cross the border as part of this surreptitious deal, who were in CBP detention for a few days as their cases were being processed, have now been released into the custody of some nonprofits on the San Diego side. What we understand is that they're being tested for COVID. Once they clear those tests, they will be allowed into the United States where they'll be able to sort of live and move freely while their asylum claims move forward.
So this arrangement, kind of fly-by-night deal, doesn't seem like clear-cut policy, but kind of like an improvised solution to a problem. Why isn't there a more clear-cut policy on when and how these Russian refugees are allowed in, whereas some people aren't allowed to be in?
It's hard to overstate how unusual and irregular this deal that we witnessed was. And I think the clearest evidence of that is the fact that nobody's admitting to it, right? We're in touch with Mexican officials who were directly involved in brokering this deal, and they're essentially lying to us about whether or not it happened. On the US side, CBP isn't even answering our emails at this point. It's something that they don't want people to know about. The reason for that is because at this point, there is no consistent, systematic, transparent policy for asylum on the border. The existing asylum system, which is pretty clearly codified in US law, is not what's being followed as a matter of fact. Instead, you have this very ad hoc and incredibly arbitrary system by which the US authorities, sometimes in cooperation with the Mexican authorities, decide on a case-by-case basis who gets to be let in. That's all a product of Title 42. Title 42 is the pandemic-era ostensibly public health measure, although it always bears repeating that it doesn't really have any grounding in science or public health. Nevertheless, sort of pretextually public health measure that allows the United States to turn away and expel any asylum seeker that arrives at the border. Given that that is sort of the reigning system at this point, everything else is done by exception, right? And there is no clearly stated, explicit policy that governs those exceptions. And because there's some complicated politics and a sort of optics involved, a lot of that, as we saw, is happening really sort of behind closed doors and very literally under cover of night.
Okay, David, so what's happening with Title 42? What's going to happen next?
We don't know exactly, but what we do know is that the sort of public and political furor around Title 42 is coming to a head, largely as a result of the arrival of these Ukrainian and now Russian refugees. Remember, Title 42 has been in place for 2 years. There are tens of thousands of migrants on the Mexico side of the border waiting for the chance to claim asylum. Most of them are black and brown people from the global south, places like Central America, Mexico, Haiti, Cameroon, other parts of Africa, South Asia. Those people are watching what's happening, these sort of special exemptions being made for white refugees from Europe, and saying, what's happening here? Why suddenly does CBP have processing capacity, and why suddenly are they willing to make these exceptions when we've been knocking on the door for more than 2 years? So that, combined with some litigation pressure that the Biden administration is facing to lift Title 42 for at least families with children, is making it so that it's possible. A lot of people expect that something is going to change with the policy in the next week or so. So the date to pay attention to is on April 1st, the CDC has to decide whether to extend or rescind Title 42. The CDC is not really acting autonomously on this. It's under a lot of pressure from the White House and DHS to make a decision either way. I think what we can expect is that there will be some change to Title 42. Perhaps it'll be lifted for families with children, but not for single adults. We can't be totally sure, though. Either way, I think it's likely that something will change in the way that Title 42 is implemented on the ground here on the border.
Thank you, David, for your reporting.